The people who betray you for money rarely expect destiny to send a king to collect the debt. The chains around Charlotte Brooks' wrists felt colder than the October rain dripping through the cracked ceiling above her. Every breath echoed inside the abandoned stone chapel, where dozens of candles flickered with an unnatural blue glow, casting restless shadows across broken, stained glass windows. Figures in dark robes surrounded a weathered altar, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. She had stopped asking where they were taking her nearly an hour ago, because every answer had been another lie. One of the strangers smiled as he tightened the knot around her wrists and quietly said, "Your family signed everything willingly." Charlotte stared at him, unable to process the words. Family. The word hurt more than the rope. Her stepmother's smile from that morning flashed through her mind, warm for the first time in years. Her stepsisters had hugged her before she climbed into the black SUV, telling her she had finally been chosen for a housekeeping position at a wealthy private estate outside Boston. They had even packed her favorite sweater, something they had never done before. For one impossible moment, Charlotte had believed life was finally changing. She should have known kindness from them always came with a price. The stranger placed a weathered document onto the altar. At the bottom rested 3 familiar signatures. Her stepmother, both stepsisters. Beside them sat a payment receipt totaling $3,000. Charlotte's heart dropped into silence. They hadn't found her a job. They had sold her. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled across the mountains as the old chapel trembled beneath the growing storm. One of the hooded figures slowly lifted an ancient silver pendant shaped like twisted branches wrapped around a crimson stone that shimmered beneath the candlelight. The room suddenly felt colder. Charlotte instinctively stepped backward until the ropes stopped her. "Please," she whispered. "You've made a mistake." No one answered. Every face remained hidden. Every movement felt rehearsed. The only sound was the distant wind pushing against broken windows as if something outside wanted to come in. Then every candle flame bent in exactly the same direction. Not from the wind, toward the entrance. The hooded figures exchanged nervous glances. One quietly muttered, "He's too early." Another voice answered, almost trembling, "No, that's impossible." Before Charlotte could ask who they meant, the heavy wooden doors burst open under the force of the storm. Freezing air swept through the chapel, extinguishing half the candles at once. Rain poured across the stone floor, yet no one stepped through the doorway. It was as though the darkness itself had arrived first. Hundreds of miles away, inside Blackthorn Castle overlooking the cliffs of northern Maine, King Lucian Ashford stood silently before a floor-to-ceiling window as lightning illuminated the Atlantic Ocean below. His pale reflection barely appeared in the glass, almost erased by the darkness behind him. For 7 centuries, nothing had disturbed the calm discipline of his immortal mind. Tonight was different. A sharp pressure settled beneath his ribs, ancient and unmistakable, like a forgotten promise awakening after centuries of silence. His crimson eyes narrowed toward the horizon. He could feel fear, not his own, someone else's. Human, fragile, familiar. Behind him, the massive chamber doors opened as his royal advisor entered, stopping several feet away before lowering his head respectfully. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "our scouts have confirmed another disappearance near the western border." Lucian remained motionless. "How many?" 23 this month. Silence stretched across the room before Lucian finally spoke, his calm voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Someone is hunting people inside my kingdom." Another flash of lightning illuminated the ocean. Then, for the first time in centuries, an invisible mark burned across his hand like living fire. Lucian slowly looked down at the glowing symbol forming beneath his skin. His expression did not change, but the castle itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the storm, destiny had just spoken his name. 24. Hours earlier, Charlotte Brooks had been balancing 2 paper bags filled with discounted groceries as she hurried along Maple Street, her worn sneakers splashing through shallow puddles left behind by an early morning drizzle. Every dollar she earned disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Her diner job covered groceries, her evening cleaning shifts paid the electric bill, and whatever remained usually found its way into her stepmother's purse before Charlotte ever had the chance to save it. She had long stopped asking why life always demanded more from her than it seemed to ask from everyone else. Across the street, the small neighborhood bakery displayed pumpkins in its front window, reminding everyone that Halloween was only 2 weeks away. Charlotte smiled despite herself. She had always loved autumn. It made even ordinary streets feel filled with possibility. As she approached the small blue house she had lived in since childhood, the front door swung open before she reached the porch. Her younger stepsister, Madison, actually smiled. It was so unexpected that Charlotte nearly looked behind her to see who the smile was meant for. "You are finally home," Madison said. "Mom has been waiting all morning." Charlotte blinked in surprise. Usually nobody noticed whether she came home at all. Inside, the dining room table was covered with homemade food that only appeared during birthdays or holidays. Her stepmother, Denise, stood beside the kitchen wearing a pleasant expression Charlotte had not seen since her father passed away nearly 8 years earlier. "Sit down, sweetheart," Denise said warmly. "You work too hard." Charlotte hesitated before slowly taking a seat. Something about the room felt different. Too quiet. Too careful. Her older stepsister, Rebecca, poured her a glass of sweet tea without complaining. Denise even asked about her day before Charlotte had spoken a single word. It was everything Charlotte had secretly wished for during countless lonely nights. For one fragile moment, she allowed herself to believe they had finally become a family. Denise reached across the table and gently placed an envelope into Charlotte's hands. "A friend of mine owns a private estate in northern Maine," she explained. "They need someone honest, hardworking, and trustworthy. The pay is more than you have ever made." Charlotte stared at the typed offer inside. "Housekeeping assistant. Temporary residence included. Weekly salary far beyond anything she had imagined." Her eyes widened. "This cannot be real," she whispered. Denise smiled again. Sometimes good people finally catch a break. Tears threatened to form in Charlotte's eyes. She thanked each of them sincerely, completely unaware that none of them could meet her gaze for more than a second. Later that afternoon, she packed everything she owned into one small duffel bag. Her father had once told her that kindness always found its way home. She repeated those words quietly while folding his old photograph into her sweater pocket. Outside, a black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled into the driveway exactly on time. The driver wore an expensive charcoal suit and politely opened the rear passenger door. Everything appeared professional, respectable, safe. Denise hugged Charlotte before she climbed inside. Rebecca handed her a paper bag filled with sandwiches for the drive. Madison even slipped her favorite gray sweater into the duffel bag. Charlotte smiled through grateful tears as the vehicle slowly disappeared down the quiet neighborhood street. None of them waved after the first turn. Several miles away, deep beneath Blackthorn Castle, King Lucian Ashford stood inside an ancient chamber lined with towering shelves of forgotten records. A glowing mark still burned faintly across his hand. His oldest advisor carefully opened a weathered leather book that had not been touched for centuries. Symbols identical to the one on Lucian's skin slowly appeared across the faded pages. The old advisor swallowed nervously. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "the true bride mark has awakened." Lucian did not answer immediately. His crimson eyes remained fixed upon the glowing pages. Then he quietly asked the only question that mattered. Who reached her first? The black sport utility vehicle left the interstate just as the last trace of daylight disappeared behind thick clouds. Charlotte watched familiar towns fade into dense forests where towering pine trees stood like silent walls on both sides of the narrow highway. Her phone had lost signal almost an hour earlier. She tried not to worry. Wealthy families often owned estates in remote places. That was what she kept telling herself. The driver had barely spoken since they left Boston. Every answer came politely but briefly, as though conversation itself was forbidden. Charlotte finally smiled and asked, "How much farther?" The man glanced into the rearview mirror for only a second before replying, "Almost there, Miss Brooks." His voice carried no emotion. Minutes later, the vehicle turned onto an old gravel road hidden behind rusted iron gates that stood already open. Charlotte frowned. This did not look like the entrance to a private estate. There were no lights, no gardens, no signs of life, only endless woods swallowed by heavy fog. The road twisted through the forest until an enormous abandoned stone chapel appeared at the top of a hill, its broken bell tower reaching into the dark sky like a forgotten monument. The driver stepped out first and opened her door with the same professional courtesy he had shown all afternoon. "Please follow me." Charlotte climbed out slowly, hugging her duffel bag against her chest. The air smelled strangely metallic, mixed with damp earth and old stone. Every instinct quietly urged her to leave. "I thought this was someone's home," she said carefully. "It is," the driver answered without looking back. "For tonight." A cold shiver traveled down Charlotte's spine. Inside the chapel, dozens of candles illuminated cracked walls and faded murals that had almost disappeared with time. Several people dressed in elegant black clothing stood waiting in complete silence. None of them smiled. None introduced themselves. A woman approached Charlotte carrying a clipboard. "Charlotte Brooks?" she asked pleasantly. Charlotte nodded. "Please sign here to confirm your arrival." Charlotte reached for the clipboard but hesitated. The page contained only her name. Everything else had already been completed. Before she could ask another question, a quiet sound echoed. From somewhere deeper inside the building, a child was crying. It lasted only a few seconds before suddenly stopping. Charlotte instinctively turned toward the sound. "Is someone hurt?" she asked. Nobody answered. The woman gently lowered the clipboard. "Please remain where you are." Another muffled cry drifted through the hallway. This time Charlotte did not hesitate. She slipped around the group and hurried toward the sound despite several voices calling after her. The narrow corridor led to a small storage room where she found a frightened little girl no older than 7 sitting alone on an old wooden crate. Tears covered the child's face. She clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, missing one button eye. Charlotte immediately knelt beside her. "Hey there," she whispered softly. "My name is Charlotte. Are you all right?" The little girl shook her head. "I want my mommy." Charlotte wrapped her own sweater around the child's shoulders. "We are going to figure this out together." The girl slowly reached for Charlotte's hand. The moment their fingers touched, warmth spread through Charlotte's palm like gentle sunlight after weeks of winter. Neither of them noticed the faint golden symbol that briefly shimmered beneath Charlotte's skin before disappearing again. Somewhere beyond the chapel walls, deep beneath the ancient forest, invisible currents of old magic awakened after centuries of silence. Inside Blackthorn Castle, every candle lining the royal throne room suddenly flared brighter at exactly the same moment. Lucian stopped walking. His hand closed into a fist as the glowing mark across his skin burned hotter than before. His advisors stared in stunned silence while ancient portraits hanging across the chamber began trembling against the stone walls. The oldest council member slowly lowered himself to one knee, his face drained of color. "Your Majesty," he whispered, unable to hide the fear in his voice, "she is no longer alone. The bond has begun." Charlotte tightened the gray sweater around the little girl's shoulders as distant footsteps echoed through the stone hallway. The child gripped the worn stuffed rabbit with both hands and refused to let go of Charlotte's fingers. "What is your name?" Charlotte asked softly. The girl hesitated before whispering, "Emily." Charlotte smiled warmly. "That is a beautiful name." Emily looked toward the doorway with frightened eyes. "They said I should stay quiet." Charlotte gently brushed a strand of hair away from the child's face. No child should ever have to hear those words. Before she could say anything else, the woman carrying the clipboard appeared at the entrance. Her pleasant smile had disappeared. "Miss Brooks," she said calmly, "you were instructed to remain in the main hall." Charlotte slowly stood while keeping Emily behind her. "This little girl is scared. Where are her parents?" The woman offered no answer. Instead, 2 men in dark suits stepped into the hallway. They remained perfectly still, watching every movement. Charlotte felt her heartbeat quicken. Nothing about this place resembled the housekeeping position she had accepted. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," Charlotte said. "I would like to leave." Silence filled the corridor. The woman lowered her eyes for only a moment before quietly replying, "That is no longer possible." Charlotte instinctively stepped backward, placing herself between Emily and the strangers. The movement was small, almost unnoticed, yet something extraordinary happened. A faint golden glow shimmered beneath Charlotte's wrist for less than a second. Every candle lining the hallway flickered at once before returning to normal. The woman stared at Charlotte's hand, her expression suddenly filled with confusion. One of the suited men whispered under his breath, "Did you see that?" The other slowly nodded without taking his eyes off Charlotte. Hundreds of miles away, Blackthorn Castle seemed to awaken alongside the mysterious light. The ancient bells inside the highest tower began ringing on their own despite the still evening air. Servants froze where they stood. Members of the royal guard exchanged uncertain glances. Nothing like this had happened in living memory. Deep inside the Hall of Kings, Lucian Ashford stood before an enormous circular table carved from black marble. Around him sat 12 members of the royal council, each older than the oldest nation on earth. None of them appeared pleased. Lord Cedric, the eldest council member, folded his hands together. "Your Majesty," he began carefully. "History teaches us that these ancient signs often mislead those who wish to believe impossible stories." Lucian remained silent. Another counselor spoke next. "The true bride legend has been dormant for nearly 1,000 years. Legends survive because truth survives," Lucian answered calmly. His voice remained quiet, yet every word carried absolute authority. Lady Evelyn leaned forward. "Even if the mark has returned, we cannot allow a human into the royal bloodline. The balance of every vampire house would change." Lucian's crimson eyes met hers. "Did I ask for permission?" The chamber fell completely silent. No one answered. Finally, the oldest advisor entered carrying another weathered book wrapped in faded crimson cloth. He carefully opened it across the table. The yellowed pages revealed an illustration of a young human woman surrounded by golden light, while a pale king stood beside her beneath a crimson moon. Every face around the table grew tense. Beneath the drawing were only 9 words. "When kindness awakens the mark, destiny cannot be denied." No one spoke for several long seconds. Then a royal messenger hurried into the chamber. "People who brought us here." The heavy wooden doors at the end of the corridor creaked open with slow, deliberate weight, but no one stepped through immediately. The storm outside seemed to rush into the chapel first, carrying cold air that swept across the stone floor and extinguished another row of candles. Emily pressed closer to Charlotte, hiding behind her as the strange silence grew heavier. Every person in the hallway instinctively turned toward the entrance. Even the 2 men in dark suits took an uneasy step backward. Charlotte could not explain why, but the fear filling the room no longer belonged to her. It belonged to everyone else. The woman with the clipboard forced a nervous smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Remain calm," she instructed, though her own voice had begun to shake. One of the suited men hurried toward the main hall while another quietly reached into his jacket, stopping only when a low rumble echoed through the building. It was not thunder. It sounded like dozens of engines approaching from outside. Charlotte glanced toward the nearest window. Through sheets of rain, she could barely make out long beams of white light climbing the winding road toward the abandoned chapel. One vehicle became 3. 3 became 10. Within seconds, an entire procession of black luxury vehicles surrounded the hilltop. Every engine stopped at exactly the same moment. The silence afterward felt even louder than the storm. Inside the chapel, whispered conversations instantly broke out among the waiting strangers. "How did they find us?" someone muttered. "That is impossible," another answered. Nobody knew this location. Charlotte looked from one frightened face to another, realizing these people had expected complete control only moments earlier. Emily tugged gently on her sleeve. "The nice king is here," the little girl whispered with surprising certainty. Charlotte blinked. "You know who is outside?" Emily slowly nodded. "My mommy said if I was ever afraid, I should pray that he would find me." Before Charlotte could ask another question, the massive front doors of the chapel opened completely. Rain blew across the marble floor as several tall figures dressed in elegant black coats entered with calm, disciplined movements. None carried visible weapons. None raised their voices. Yet every step they took carried quiet authority. They spread through the chapel with practiced precision, creating a clear path from the entrance to the old altar. Then he appeared. Lucian Ashford walked inside without hurry, his long black coat untouched by the rain despite the storm raging behind him. His pale face remained calm, his silver-gray eyes scanning the room with measured focus until they settled on Charlotte. The moment their eyes met, time itself seemed to hesitate. Charlotte had never seen anyone like him. He looked neither young nor old, neither welcoming nor cruel. He simply carried the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his strength to anyone. Lucian stopped several feet away. His gaze briefly shifted toward Emily, who immediately smiled through her tears. "I knew you would come," she whispered. A faint warmth spread across Lucien's expression before his attention returned to Charlotte. The glowing mark beneath his hand pulsed once beneath the fabric of his glove. Charlotte felt the same warmth beneath her own wrist. Neither understood why. Across the room, the woman with the clipboard gathered enough courage to step forward. "This matter does not concern your kingdom," she declared carefully. "The contracts have already been signed." Lucien looked toward the weathered document resting on the altar. His expression remained perfectly composed. "No contract," he replied quietly, "has authority over a person's freedom." His voice was calm, almost gentle, yet every word echoed through the ancient chapel with unmistakable certainty. Several strangers lowered their eyes immediately. Others exchanged anxious glances. One by one, they slowly stepped away from Charlotte as though an invisible line had been drawn around her. Lucien took one final step forward before speaking again. "Bring the child." Emily reached for him without hesitation. Then his gaze returned to Charlotte, lingering for only a heartbeat longer. "And no one," he said softly, "will separate her from my protection again." At that exact moment, the ancient pendant resting upon the altar cracked down its center, and every candle in the chapel burst into brilliant golden light. Charlotte stood frozen as the chapel filled with a silence unlike anything she had ever experienced. Moments earlier, the room had belonged to strangers who believed they controlled every outcome. Now every eye followed King Lucien Ashford instead. The golden light from the candles reflected across the cracked stone walls, replacing the cold blue glow that had filled the building only minutes before. Emily walked without fear until she reached Lucien's side. The little girl slipped her tiny hand into his, and for the first time since Charlotte had met her, the child smiled with complete trust. Lucien gently rested his free hand on Emily's shoulder before looking towards Charlotte once again. "Are you injured?" he asked. His voice remained calm, carrying genuine concern rather than command. Charlotte slowly shook her head. "I do not think so." She hesitated before adding, "I am only confused." A faint expression that almost resembled a smile crossed Lucien's face. "That is understandable." Before either of them could speak again, the woman with the clipboard stepped forward once more, her confidence clearly fading. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "this arrangement was approved through private agreements. No laws have been broken." Lucien glanced toward the signed document still resting on the altar. "A signature obtained through deception is not an agreement," he replied. "It is a betrayal." His words echoed through the chapel with quiet certainty. Nobody challenged him. Several of the strangers lowered their heads, while others slowly backed away from the altar as though hoping to disappear into the shadows. One elderly man finally spoke. "We did not know who the young woman was." Lucien answered without raising his voice. "Neither did those who sold her." Charlotte looked toward him in surprise. "Sold?" she whispered. Although she had already seen the receipt bearing her family's signatures, hearing the words spoken aloud somehow made it more real. Lucien met her eyes. "You deserved honesty from the beginning." Charlotte lowered her gaze, struggling to hold back tears. She remembered every birthday forgotten, every extra shift she worked, every meal she skipped so the rest of the family could eat first. She had spent years believing that if she simply tried harder, loved more deeply, and complained less, one day she would finally be accepted. Instead, kindness had become something others used against her. Emily quietly squeezed Charlotte's hand again, reminding her she was no longer standing alone. Outside the chapel, headlights continued illuminating the rain-soaked hillside, while members of the royal escort maintained their silent positions. No shouting filled the night. No panic spread through the grounds. Everything moved with calm discipline, reflecting the order of a kingdom that did not need chaos to demonstrate strength. Inside Blackthorn Castle, however, the royal council had already gathered once more. News of the chapel reached them through magical communication faster than any ordinary messenger could travel. Lord Cedric folded his hands with visible concern. "If the human woman truly carries the awakened mark, every noble house will demand answers." Lady Evelyn looked toward the empty royal throne. "Many will refuse to recognize her." Another council member quietly added, "Some may even try to separate them before the prophecy can unfold." The chamber doors opened before anyone could continue. Lucien entered with measured steps, Charlotte and Emily walking several feet behind him beneath the protection of the royal escort. Every conversation stopped instantly. Charlotte had never seen a room so magnificent. Towering marble columns stretched toward a ceiling painted with stars, while enormous crystal chandeliers bathed the hall in warm golden light. Yet despite its beauty, she could feel dozens of curious eyes studying her from every direction. She instinctively looked down at her worn sneakers, faded jeans, and borrowed sweater. She did not belong in a place like this. Lucien noticed her hesitation. Without saying a word, he removed his own dark overcoat and gently placed it around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, respectful, and entirely unexpected. Then he faced the royal council with unwavering composure. Before anyone speaks, he said evenly, "Understand this. She enters this castle as my honored guest. She will be treated with the dignity every human being deserves." Across the chamber, several council members exchanged uneasy glances. Deep within the oldest tower of Blackthorn Castle, an ancient bell that had remained silent for nearly 1,000 years suddenly rang once, as though history itself had just acknowledged Charlotte Brooke's arrival. Charlotte barely noticed the magnificent castle surrounding her. The polished marble floors, towering crystal chandeliers, and centuries-old portraits seemed impossibly distant compared to the weight pressing against her heart. She kept replaying one sentence over and over. They had sold her, not abandoned her, not forgotten her, sold her. She lowered her eyes as attendants quietly passed through the grand hall, each moving with graceful precision. No one mocked her worn clothes. No one whispered behind her back. That simple kindness felt almost unfamiliar. Lucien walked beside her without rushing, allowing the silence to settle naturally. After several moments, he stopped before an enormous window overlooking the rain-soaked cliffs. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly into the darkness below. "You are safe here," he said quietly. Charlotte nodded, but her voice remained fragile. "I keep wondering what I did wrong." Lucien turned toward her. "You did nothing wrong." She gave a faint, saddened smile. "People always say that, but there is always a reason someone is not wanted." Lucien looked at the storm beyond the glass before answering. "Sometimes the reason belongs to those who failed to recognize someone's worth." Charlotte could not answer. Tears filled her eyes before she quickly looked away, embarrassed to let a stranger see her cry. Lucien pretended not to notice, offering her the dignity of privacy instead of sympathy. Across the hall, Emily laughed softly as two castle maids showed her a small white kitten curled inside a basket near the fireplace. The little girl's fear had almost completely disappeared. Watching her smile brought unexpected warmth to Charlotte's heart. If nothing else, at least one frightened child had found safety tonight. An elderly butler approached Lucien with a respectful bow. "Your Majesty, Archivist Rowan requests your presence in the Hall of Records. He believes he has found something." Lucien glanced toward Charlotte. "Will you walk with me?" She hesitated. "I do not wish to interrupt your work. You are part of it now." Those words lingered in her mind as they followed the butler through quiet corridors lined with shelves of ancient books and paintings older than the United States itself. At the end of the passage stood an enormous circular library where thousands of leather-bound volumes reached nearly to the ceiling. Archivist Rowan, a gentle elderly scholar with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carefully unrolled an ancient parchment across a large oak table. "Your Majesty," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "the awakened mark led me to examine records connected to Miss Brooke's family." Charlotte looked up in surprise. "My family?" Rowan nodded. "More specifically, your father." Lucien remained silent while the archivist turned several brittle pages inside a weathered journal. A faded photograph slipped onto the table. Charlotte immediately recognized the smiling man holding her as a little girl. "Dad," she whispered. Rowan gently placed another document beside the photograph. It was nearly 200 years old. "This journal belonged to one of your father's ancestors," Rowan explained. "Every generation recorded the same promise." Charlotte leaned closer as Rowan slowly read the faded words aloud. "If the Pale King should ever return, our family will remember the debt of kindness freely given." Charlotte frowned. "I do not understand." Lucien answered quietly. "Nearly 150 years ago, one of your ancestors sheltered an injured traveler during a blizzard. Charlotte looked at him. That traveler was you. Lucien gave a small nod. He believed I was simply a lost stranger. He never asked my name. He never expected anything in return. Rowan carefully opened another page, revealing an old charcoal sketch of a young farmer standing beside a pale man wrapped in a heavy blanket. Although centuries separated the drawing from the present day, Charlotte immediately recognized Lucien's face. He had not changed. Her breath caught. Then my father knew about this? Rowan gently shook his head. The journals disappeared before he inherited the family home. Lucien's expression hardened slightly. Someone wanted that history erased. Charlotte slowly remembered something she had dismissed years ago. After her father passed away, her stepmother had insisted on throwing away several boxes stored in the attic. She had claimed they contained only mold-damaged papers. Charlotte had never been allowed to look inside them. A quiet chill settled over the library as the realization took shape. Selling Charlotte had never been a desperate decision made for money alone. Someone had spent years making certain she would never discover who she truly was. At that exact moment, far beyond the castle walls, a cloaked figure watched Blackthorn Castle from the edge of the forest and quietly whispered, "She remembers more quickly than we expected." Morning sunlight spilled across Blackthorn Castle, turning the rain-soaked cliffs into shimmering silver as if the storm had never existed. Charlotte stood alone on a balcony outside the royal library, holding the faded photograph of her father that archivist Rowan had carefully placed into a protective leather sleeve. She traced the edges with her fingertips, remembering the way he used to tell her that true character was measured by how someone treated people who could offer nothing in return. At the time, she had believed they were simply comforting words from a loving father. Now they sounded like the final lesson of a man protecting a secret he never had the chance to explain. The balcony doors opened quietly behind her. Lucien stepped outside carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. He handed one to Charlotte without a word. She accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you." For several moments, neither of them spoke. They simply watched seabirds glide above the crashing waves far below. Finally, Charlotte asked the question that had been weighing on her heart since the previous evening. If my family had never betrayed me, would we have ever met? Lucien considered the question carefully before answering. Perhaps not today. He looked toward the horizon. But destiny often finds another road when one is closed. Charlotte lowered her eyes. "I still wish none of it had happened." "So do I," Lucien admitted quietly. His honesty surprised her more than any grand promise could have. Before the conversation could continue, the deep sound of the ancient castle bell echoed across the grounds 3 times instead of once. Castle staff immediately stopped what they were doing. Royal guards straightened their posture. Even the servants exchanged puzzled glances. Archivist Rowan hurried onto the balcony carrying another weathered book beneath his arm. "Your Majesty," he said, catching his breath, "the Hall of Oaths has opened." Lucien's expression became serious. "It has remained sealed for centuries." Rowan nodded. "Until this morning." Minutes later, they entered a circular chamber hidden beneath the oldest tower of the castle. Massive stone doors stood open, revealing a room illuminated by soft golden light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. In the center rested a crystal pedestal supporting an ancient silver crown and a book bound in white leather unlike anything Charlotte had ever seen. As she stepped closer, the book slowly opened by itself. Its blank pages filled with elegant golden writing before everyone's eyes. Rowan read the words aloud with visible astonishment. "When the mark of promise awakens through an act of selfless kindness, the chosen guardian shall stand beside the rightful king by free will alone. No title, no law, and no bloodline may force or forbid that choice." The chamber fell silent. Lord Cedric, who had quietly followed the group, looked toward Lucien with concern. "The ancient covenant leaves no room for political debate." Lady Evelyn slowly lowered her head. "Then the council has no authority to reject her." Charlotte looked from one face to another, overwhelmed by what she was hearing. "I do not understand. I have never asked for any of this." Lucien stepped beside her. "That is precisely why. The ancient laws recognize you." She looked at him. The wind carried the scent of the ocean across the highest balcony of Blackthorn Castle as twilight painted the horizon in shades of crimson and gold. Charlotte stood quietly beside the ancient stone railing, watching waves crash against the cliffs hundreds of feet below. Less than 48 hours earlier, she had believed her future would be another endless cycle of long shifts, unpaid kindness, and silent disappointment. Now she found herself surrounded by a world she had never imagined existed. Yet despite everything that had happened, one thought remained stronger than all the others. "I still do not want anyone to suffer because of me," she said softly. Lucien, standing beside her with his hands resting behind his back, looked toward the distant sea before answering. "That is exactly why destiny chose you instead of someone seeking power." Charlotte smiled faintly. "I am not sure destiny always knows what it is doing." A quiet laugh escaped Lucien before he could stop it. The sound surprised even him. Several nearby guards exchanged brief glances, having never heard their king laugh aloud. Emily came running across the balcony with the small white kitten safely cradled in her arms. "Look," she said excitedly. "She follows me everywhere." Charlotte knelt beside the little girl, gently scratching the kitten behind its ears. "Maybe she already knows she found her family." Emily wrapped one arm around Charlotte's neck without hesitation. "I found mine too." Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, holding the child close. Sometimes family was not defined by the people who shared your last name. Sometimes it was found in the people who chose to stay. Behind them, the castle doors opened as Archivist Rowan approached, carrying the ancient white leather book once again. "Your Majesty," he announced. "The final page has revealed itself." Lucien and Charlotte followed him into the Hall of Oaths, where members of the Royal Council already stood waiting in respectful silence. The glowing book rested upon the crystal pedestal, its final page shining with warm golden light. Rowan carefully read the newly revealed words. "The bond shall never be sealed by fear, obligation, or command. Only when both hearts freely choose the same path shall the kingdom enter its brightest age." Charlotte listened quietly before looking toward Lucien. "So nothing has already been decided?" Lucien slowly shook his head. "No." He stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance between them. "Your future remains yours to choose." Charlotte searched his face. There was no expectation in his eyes. No pressure. Only patience. For the first time since arriving at the castle, she felt completely free. She smiled gently. "Then my first choice is simple." Lucien waited. "I would like to stay here for a while." A warm smile finally reached Lucien's eyes. "Then Blackthorn Castle will always have a place for you." At that exact moment, the ancient silver crown resting beside the book released a soft golden glow before becoming still once more. Lord Cedric lowered his head respectfully. "The hall has accepted her decision." Lady Evelyn stepped forward and offered Charlotte a graceful bow. "Miss Brooks, I judged you before knowing your heart. I hope one day you may forgive that mistake." Charlotte quickly returned the bow. "Kindness always deserves another chance." The words settled over the chamber like quiet sunlight after a long winter. Outside, the clouds finally parted, allowing moonlight to shine across the cliffs and the endless Atlantic beyond. Far below the castle, the mysterious cloaked observer watched the glowing towers one last time before disappearing into the forest without a sound. Hidden beneath the cloak, an ancient silver emblem matched the symbol carved into forgotten ruins scattered across distant kingdoms. The stranger smiled faintly. "The true bride has been found," the voice whispered into the night. "Now every hidden throne will begin to move." High above the sea, Charlotte looked toward the stars with peaceful eyes. She had entered the castle believing she had lost everything. Instead, she had discovered the truth her father had tried to teach her all along. A person's greatest value is never decided by those willing to sell their kindness. It is revealed by those wise enough to treasure it.